Hi guys, welcome to our session. So for today's session, we'll learn about transaction handling. So in SAP Business 1, when a data operation is performed on a business object, a transaction is started. So the SAP Business 1 database uses transactions to keep the data consistent. If the operation is successful, then a commit operation is issued and the data is saved. If the operation fails, then a rollback operation is started and the data is disregarded. If the data operation is performed on a single business object, all this is done by automatically. So, by default, we use the single transaction. If you want to perform database action that must be divided into several steps, you can use the start transaction method at the start of a series of a program. When a global transaction is started, with the start transaction, the business object uses this global transaction. If one of the business object fails during any process, the transaction ends and an automatic rollback operation is started. When the transaction is successful, you must use the end transaction method to free the lock records and allow other user access to them. So use the end transaction property in case you are not sure about the status of the transaction. So always use a transaction using the global transaction or the single transaction. So we have three important things about here is the start transaction. So start transaction is we start the global transaction, and then we have a boolean in transaction to check if a transaction is alive or not, and then the end transaction to commit or to roll back a transaction. So here is the flowchart of the global transaction. So we need to start a transaction, then we run a list of operation on the DB. Did all operations succeed? If yes, then you can still choose to roll back or commit. And then, if no, at least one operation failed, then the automatic rollback happened and transaction has been terminated. So how can we implement the global transaction in our code? So let's go to our script. So first, we go back to the copy to button we have created last session. So here, we will apply the global transaction. So first, we have to start the transaction. So here. So what if before we do the global transaction, we use the single transaction? What if we have an error on the invoice? For example, we will make some error. For example, card code. This card code is not existing. Then let's try. So if before we run the script, okay, we check what are the last transaction we have on the sales order and the invoice. So in the sales order, my last document is 10. And on my AR invoice or sales invoice, my last document is 1. Okay? So you can see we have 10 and 1. But here, we will force an error on the sales invoice side. What will happen? So I click the copy to. So sales order is added. So my sales order is already on the system. But my invoice has an invalid BP. So what happened? On Subbish 1, if we go to the sales invoice, I already have the doc entry number 10, but my invoice is at 1. So sales invoice did not roll back. Why? Because we use the single transaction. Remember that single transactions commits every data operation. So when we call the sales order.add, it will call commit if this is successful. And then if we call the sales invoice.add, it calls the rollback, which is it can only roll back the sales invoice because sales order is already committed. So we don't want to have that scenario where one document is not added while the other document is added. For that, we will use the global transaction. First, we need to start the transaction. So how can we start the transaction? Before we initialize the sales invoice, we check first if we have an alive company transaction. So in transaction. If this is true, okay, if this is true, so we will use not true, okay. Then if there is no live transaction, then we will start the transaction. Whole company dot start transaction. And then all the transaction below the start transaction is under a transaction. So we already started the global transaction here. And then at the end of our code, it says that if we encounter an error on the sales order, it's automatically rolled back. But if all transactions are created or successful, we need to choose if we need to commit or to roll back our transaction. So here, we need to check again if O company is alive in transaction. So if it's true, then we need to commit. So O company dot end transaction, then we can select commit or rollback. Okay. So if we have an error in the sales or sales invoice, just like our sample, we don't need to call the end transaction dot rollback because it will automatically roll back the transaction. We just need to call the end transaction if all transactions or all processes are successful. So now we will test the script. So we are connected to the API. We click the copy to. Sales order is added. Invoice is not added. So we check on the subbish 1 if the invoice is rollback. So remember, the last number is 11. So we should not get the document number 12. So we don't have document number 12. So global transaction prevented the data inconsistency in our code. So now we will try to create the invoice plus the sales order. So now we corrected the card code. Then connected to the API, click the copy to again. Sales order added, sales invoice is added. So if we verify, if we have the sales order, so we have the sales order, then verify if we have the AR invoice, we have the AR invoice. So that's how transaction handling works on SAP Business One DI API. So that's all for today's session. So see you again next session.